For Bama Central's 3 and now, I'm Mason Smith along with Joey Blackwell and Katie Wyndham. Guys, we now are 4 games into the season. We've got to see the Alabama offense and defense really kind of, find more of an identity as they approach SEC play. But Katie, starting with you, what are some surprises? What are some things that are catching your eye 4 games into the season?
Yeah, I think one of the players who's been the biggest surprise for me is Trayshawn Holden at wide receiver. Coming into the season, he was someone being kind of hyped up by his teammates, but in his first 2 years at Alabama, he hadn't done a ton to necessarily prove that he was going to be able to take on that kind of head role in the wide receiver, in which he's done so far through 4 games as the leading receiver. And he's talked about it, and Bryce Young has talked about it, and Nick Saban's talked about it. The key for him has been patience. It's something he struggled with in his first 2 years, but now that he's a junior, he's kind of developed into that role. So he's kind of the surprise individual. And then overall for the team, something that's kind of surprised me is, that 4 games in, the total touchdown leaders are Bryce Young, Jamarian Miller, and Jason McClellan, all tied at 2. So through 4 games, there's no running back that has more than 2 touchdowns. And so not that Alabama was necessarily going to have a ton of rushing touchdowns when you have a quarterback like Bryce Young, but I think the fact that 4 games in and Jahmyr Gibbs still doesn't have a rushing touchdown is kind of surprising, even though he's not necessarily a power back. He also has obviously added a ton, multiple receiving touchdowns, but that's just something I wouldn't have necessarily thought coming into this season, that 4 games in that they'd be at this point.
Yeah, for me, Katie was on the offensive side of the football. I'd like to talk about the defense. I think we all knew that this defense was going to be really good heading into this season. Through 4 games, they've only given up 2 offensive touchdowns, so that's obviously a great showing for them. But what's impressed me most, and what I find the most surprising, is the lack of turnovers forced by this defense. Through 4 games, Will Anderson's pick 6 is the only turnover that we've seen so far. And while Nick Saban even said after the Vanderbilt game that he'd like to see more turnovers forced, at the same time, while that hasn't happened, it's honestly a good thing that we've seen this defense be so dominant despite not being able to force the ball, force the ball to be turned over. Through 4 games at the same time, they really have. I think Texas is the only team that's had over 200 offensive yards. That might not be correct, but they've all been hovering around that number. So when you have a defense is able to do that without turning the ball over, that's very impressive, and that's something that's been leaping off the page for me over these past few weeks here.
Definitely, Joe. We've kind of going back offense, defense. I'm taking it back to offense. I'm going to focus on the offensive line. That was one thing that was a big focus going into camp. I think people were concerned about how they're going to handle the running game, and blocking for Jahmyr Gibbs. While the running game is still, working its way out, both from the offensive line and running back perspective, offensive lines really showed up in the passing game. Nick Saban mentioned during the post-game press conference on Saturday that when the big plays were arrived or rose up, it was because of the offensive line giving time for Bryce Young to throw. They were handling Vanderbilt's pressure packages very well. Of course, there are still some things to work on, but I think with Tyler Steen and some of the youth and experience that they mix with that offensive line, I think they're going to look really good going forward against Arkansas and the rest of SEC play. But from Mason Smith, Katie Wyndham, and Joey Blackwood, it's been 3 and out. See you next time.